Today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is Curt Meine. He's the author of We Can Do Better, collected writings on land conservation and public policy. It was published just this last October in 2025. And with that, Curt, I'm going to hand the baton off to you.
Excellent, Jamie. Thanks so much. And thank you for inviting me to do this presentation. Um, Thank you to all of you for showing up on screen. I just took a look at the list. I see lots of friends and colleagues and wish you all well and wish you a good new year from very chilly, frigid Wisconsin. Um, I'm going to go right to my screen because I haven't done this version of the presentation before. So I want to get right to it so I don't fall behind on time. And you ought to be seeing now a title slide.
It's there.
Good, thanks. And a couple caveats here. First of all, as Jamie mentioned, I live in rural Wisconsin at the very end of my internet cable line, and sometimes I do freeze up. If that happens, I tend to unfreeze after about 5 or 6 seconds, so bear with it. And if worst comes to worst, I have my backup computer ready to fire up. So, um, yeah, I am pleased to be able to share with you this story of Paul Johnson and a couple caveats on this. This is the new book, and so I really appreciate the opportunity to share the word of this new volume. I'm not the author, I should say. I'm the editor. I have a lengthy introduction, but Paul is really Paul's book, and I've said that, and in lots of other presentations. And I'll talk a little bit about Paul as a writer later on. Some of you are going to know Paul's name a bit if you've been involved, especially at the intersection of agriculture and conservation. For some of you, he's a new figure. And my other caveat here is that Paul was also a dear friend and mentor to me. So although I will strive to be scholarly and academic in this talk, there's no way I can hide that. Paul was my buddy, and I had many good adventures with him over the years, and I've tried to do honor to him. Paul passed away in 2021 in the later stages of the COVID shutdown. So that was really the prompt, and I can say more about that if people want to know the origins of the book. But here's what I'll do over the next, again, half an hour, a little bit more maybe. Just a few opening words on private lands and conservation history. For those of you who, again, don't know Paul, I'll give some biographical background on his life and career. But the bulk of this talk will really try to focus in on his work at the Natural Resources Conservation Service, where he became chief, and then a little bit about the work that he carried on afterwards, and a few final reflections. And yes, I'd welcome lots of conversation, especially if there's anyone online who might have had a chance to know or work with Paul. I'd really appreciate hearing from you if by chance any of you have had that opportunity. So let me start with just a little introductory statement from Paul himself. I'll talk about this publication later in the presentation, but this was one of his devoted achievements when he was head of the NRCS during the Clinton administration. This document was conceived with a mission of putting private lands conservation back on the map of policymakers, to be very direct about it. And here you see it reflected in one of his statements in the introduction. Today we understand that narrowly circumscribed areas of natural beauty and protected land alone can't provide the quality of environment people want and need. We must recognize the needs of America's private land and private landowners to truly have a geography of hope. And many of you listening will recognize that concluding phrase that he borrowed from Wallace Stegner, of course. So this is building on actually a couple other things that I have been able to do in conjunction with the Forest History Society and American Society for Environmental History. And I just wanted to highlight these briefly. A couple years ago, Jamie, thank you so much. You invited me to do the Lynn Day lectureship. Gee, more than 3 years ago now. And it was a discussion of sort of how we might rethink this strict binary between public and private land in thinking about conservation history. And later on, that was published a year ago, almost now, well, spring of 2025, in a special section of the journal Environmental History. And we have a couple links for these two things that Jamie and might be able to help punch up there. But I formalized that lecture into a little more formal academic discussion of, again, looking beyond the binary public and private. In retrospect, I don't think I could have done those lectures or this writing without having worked with Paul Johnson and having so many discussions with him. So this book and my retrospective today is really reflecting the devotion Paul felt to this mission of getting private lands conservation back on the map of the environmental movement, to kind of summarize it in a short way. Here's Paul in his later years. Um, Paul was not a writer per se. He didn't think of himself as a writer, but he wrote a lot in his role as a public servant and official, and later on, especially in his later years in his private life. The first part of the book is an introduction that traces his life and particularly his role in the movement towards sustainable agriculture, what we tend to call more often now regenerative agriculture. There are many terms for it, or so. I'll give you a little biographical background on Paul and how he came into this position. Paul was born at the outset of World War II out in California. He did not live in California beyond his, I think, eighth or ninth year. He moved back to the Midwest where his ancestors were from, and spent his youth in South Dakota, Illinois, a little bit in Wisconsin, bouncing around as the family moved, and followed his father's career as a preacher. That in his youth, and it was an early interest in actually engineering that brought him to the University of Illinois, where he was going to study aviation engineering. Interesting start for someone who had become a leading conservationist. Well, that was his early interest, but I actually credit this early interest with the beginning of his career in public service, because it was in fact while he was working as a student at the airport, he was invited, well, not invited, he was assigned to bring into the airport the campaign airplane of President, well, soon to be President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was on the campaign trail and landed at Champaign-Urbana, gave a speech on campus there. And it wasn't just Kennedy, it was the other dignitaries. Jackie Kennedy, I think Stuart Udall might have been on that plane. Sergeant Shriver was on that plane. And it's a real turning point for Paul, an early inflection point, and sets him on a path of public service that begins with his becoming one of the very early volunteers for the Peace Corps. Actually, Paul's future wife, Pat, was in the very first cohort of Peace Corps volunteers. I think Paul was in the second, and served his term in West Africa in Ghana. And so it was the beginning of his career of thinking about not only public service, but also thinking about global affairs. He ends up returning after the Peace Corps to go to graduate school, following and pursues his, well, receives his bachelor's and master's and pursues a PhD in forestry, undertaking research in the field in Costa Rica. Interestingly enough, he's a student of Stephen Spur. Those of you who are deep forest historians will recognize that name. Stephen Spur was the author of the book on the right here, one of the very first, if not the first, textbooks in forest ecology. And so Paul not only is changing course, but he's also studying under this fellow who helped to really bring ecological perspectives to traditional forestry training. While in Ann Arbor, Paul courts and eventually marries his wife, Patricia. Pat, who is still with us and may even be on the call. I'm not or on the Zoom today, I'm not sure. But they begin their life together. And one of Paul's first jobs, actually, as a natural resource person, is with the U.S. Forest Service. In fact, out at the Gifford Pinchot Forest in Oregon. And this begins what he thinks will be his career. He thinks he's going to kind of move in this direction. It didn't turn out that way. Paul returned to Ghana actually to do further work in community forest and research. So he's still thinking internationally, still thinking perhaps of an academic career. But in fact, he and Pat take a major turn in life. Paul leaves graduate school, all but finished with his dissertation. All he had to do was turn it in, basically, but he felt the calling to go back to the land, as did so many young people in the late 60s and early 70s. And he and Pat gravitate toward the driftless area here of the upper Mississippi River, same area I live in, and acquire a farm outside of Decorah, Iowa. And Paul turns into a dairy farmer, while Pat teaches at Luther College in Decorah. And they spend the rest of their lives together on their farm, still there, still growing Christmas trees. And so Paul has the life of a farmer, an Iowa farmer now. With all that background, however, in international work, in forestry, and in public service. He is basically drafted to become a candidate and becomes elected to the Iowa House of Representatives. It's a funny story. I won't go into it now, but basically, he left town to go hiking in the Rockies, came back, and found himself on the ballot and elected in 1984 to the Iowa House of Representatives, where he would serve 6 years, 3 terms. For you, especially if you're a Midwesterner, put yourself back in 1984 or 85 when Paul takes office and remember what was going on. It's a national problem, uh, and Paul is in the thick of it. The farm crisis of the mid 1980s was afoot, and Iowa was the epicenter with tens of thousands of farmers being forced off the land, with farmers going on food stamps, with farmer suicide rates going up. It's a very difficult, traumatic time everywhere in rural America, but especially in Iowa. And Paul's very first week in office in the state legislature in Des Moines, in fact, the main issue was how are we going to respond to this? And in fact, that becomes the very first piece of writing in this collection that I've edited because it starts Paul's career as a writer in many ways, because he starts writing to his constituents back in Northeast Iowa about what he was doing in the legislature. There were other issues, everything from educational policy to responding to apartheid in South Africa to dealing with all kinds of other environmental issues. One that was in the forefront at the time was contamination of groundwater. And this is an area of environmental policy. Many people don't think about it until it becomes an issue, until it becomes a crisis. And that was the problem in Iowa with contamination of groundwater sources. And Paul took this on. And through his efforts and several really important colleagues in the Iowa legislature, passed in 1987 a really important piece of legislation, the Groundwater Protection Act. This was unprecedented in many ways. Wisconsin here was well known for actually its work on groundwater policy. Paul looked at us and said, "We can do better," to quote a phrase. So I won't go too great detail here. The Groundwater Protection Act is well documented and has been well studied for its important innovations, but it involved things like setting standards and regs for landfills, underground storage tanks, abandoned wells, and such, monitoring through testing, plugging and rehabilitation of wells, public education and awareness, importantly, research. Paul was always devoted to supporting research to inform good policy. And so at the three public universities in Iowa, different research centers were established. And I'll draw attention to the last one in particular because I'll talk about it in a moment. But it was this act that established the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture at Iowa State, one of the very first centers for looking at alternatives to conventional agriculture. But it wasn't just the provisions of the act, it was also the kind of the moral ethical basis of it. And you see that reflected here in the last at the bottom here. The uniqueness of the act lies in calling upon all Iowans to develop a conservation ethic through programs in research, education, and demonstration. And many of you will recognize that phrase as drawing upon a tradition going back to Aldo Leopold. And in fact, it was 1987, the same year that the Groundwater Act was passed, that Iowa and others were celebrating the centennial of Aldo Leopold's birth in Burlington, Iowa. It's often forgotten that Leopold hailed from Iowa, although he's often associated with the Southwest and Wisconsin. Iowa State had hosted the centennial celebration, actually the fall before. And so Leopold had re-emerged as a son of Iowa, in a sense, and Paul picked up on that right away. But more than that, it was at this point, if you look at the history of Leopold scholarship, you'll find that Leopold was really strongly associated, of course, with wildlife conservation, wilderness protection, and so his thinking agriculture lost. And soon after this centennial, a lot of Leopold's other writings beyond St. County Almanac began to be shared with the world. They'd been buried in the archives for decades. One of them was this gem of an essay on the right here, "The Farmer as a Conservationist," published in 1939. Paul read that, and boy, he almost memorized this entire essay and would quote it in almost every speech he gave as a public official for the rest of his life. He really deeply dove into Leopold's career in writing, particularly on the intersection of agriculture and conservation. Just a couple quick items here of his continuing work in Iowa. In Iowa, a very important other act was called the Resource Enhancement Protection Act, to this day providing support and funding for local conservation projects all across Iowa. He was also very devoted to energy issues and passed one of the most important early energy efficiency pieces of legislation, not only in Iowa, but again nationally. So let's put ourselves back in these years in the late 80s, when the farm crisis was beginning to let up a little bit and the response had begun to set in around the phrase and term sustainability. We think of that term as entirely common and these days, but in those days it was a controversial term. Our Common Future, published by the UN in 1987, put it on the map globally, but it was really in Iowa where the sustainable agriculture movement gained traction and started to put some meaning to that phrase, which had been fuzzy and people weren't accustomed to it at the time. But Iowa really provided a lot of the grounding for this new way of thinking. Paul's work in Iowa made him a national figure. He is appointed to the Board on Agriculture at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. He's the first farmer to be on the Board on Agriculture for the most important scientific body in the U.S. And it's actually there where he and I intersect. Personally, I won't go into this, but I ended up working at the National Academy after grad school. And he and I both worked on this series of reports where the term sustainability now gets the stamp of approval of the National Academy through a series of reports on agriculture, forestry, international development, etc. So Paul's now a national figure. He's increasingly comfortable in the Washington arena. And it was just a year or two after that he is, after Bill Clinton is elected president, named to be chief of the Soil Conservation Service. Keep your mind on the terminology. And I love this quote from one of the publications in Washington, D.C. When Paul Johnson, former Democratic state legislator and folk hero to the sustainable agriculture movement, became chief, he didn't have to travel far to learn why the agency was in deep trouble. All he had to do was listen to his neighbors. Paul's cred, if you will, as a farmer himself, really helped him enter into this role. And yeah, a folk hero of the sustainable agriculture movement, a kind of a backhanded compliment to Paul. Here's a little shout out for you all, knowing uh, you as members, many of you of the Forest History Society. While doing some work on this, I revisited this document. I really recommend it if you're interested in looking at the history of private lands conservation. This is a really helpful document by Thomas Christensen, who I don't know, but I really appreciated this work. So just a little shout out there. But let's take a little bit of a detour. Many of you will know this history, but let's just remind ourselves the background of soil conservation and the Soil Conservation Service. Of course, the key figure historically in the movement of soil conservation is Hugh Hammond Bennett, publishing his landmark report on soil erosion in 1928. As the Dust Bowl years come on and the dust flies. Of course, the dust storms out of the west, out of the plains, were rolling east. But it was also gully erosion in other parts of the country, especially the southeast. That was the face of these dirty 30s, right? In the upper Midwest, the upper Mississippi, it's scenes like this in our highly erodible driftless area valleys. You can see the horse there for reference in the middle. And so it's a crisis. It's a crisis akin to what climate change is now in many ways. So just over the watershed divide from this scene, we come to this area, Coon Valley, a watershed out in western Wisconsin along the Mississippi River. And it's here that the very first soil conservation watershed scale project is undertaken under the then Soil Erosion Service. You can see Aldo Leopold there in the bottom left. He was an advisor to the project. And it was just 2 years after the initiation of that project as a model for other watersheds around the country that the Soil Conservation Act was passed in Congress, April 1935. Setting the scene for the evolution of that landscape and many others all across the country. This is what a typical driftless area scene looks like now out in that area. I saw Lynn Heasley on the list here. Lynn, we owe so much to you for helping document this important work. And it's an important story that is underappreciated. And Paul did, however, appreciate it, and that becomes part of the story. Very quickly, here are some landmarks in the history of the Soil Conservation Service over the decades, the act establishing it, the Conservation District Law, a forerunner to the later Conservation Reserve Program in the 50s. But it's kind of in the background of the conservation and then environmental movement, right? This is work going on quietly in rural America, apart from the suburban and urban landscapes where the environmental movement is brewing. 1980, conservation assistance to Indians on tribal lands. I want to highlight that a little bit because there is a fascinating history yet to be fully written on the intersection of Native Americans and the Soil Conservation Service. This is a dissertation, I think, waiting to be done if you're looking. 1985 brings an important shift in the Farm Bill that includes the very first conservation titles, including the Conservation Reserve Program and the term sustainability beginning to enter the lexicon. And conservation compliance, the policy provision that obligates landowners who are and farmers and other landowners who are using farm bill programs to also be in compliance with conservation standards. So again, this is on the brink of Paul becoming chief of the NRCS. But here's where we are on that brink. The farm crisis has begun to fade, but its effects are still echoing. The continuing consolidation in the agricultural economy that we read about so much now, it was already well advanced. The industrialization of agriculture post-World War II was leading to this. We had, as many of you will remember, a growing movement against the environmental movement, calling itself the property rights movement, focused on private property and private lands. The Farm Bill initiatives, the emergence of climate change as an important matter of policy, the emergence of the sustainable agriculture movement, but again, a lack of appreciation among the environmental organizations, in Washington, D.C., especially for this history. The joke that Paul used to tell on this was, he says, I became chief of the SCS, the Secret Conservation Service. And so there was in his mind as he took office a sense that we needed to raise the profile of this history. And again, those of you of an age will remember as Paul takes office, that's when Newt Gingrich also becomes Speaker of the House and ramping up the political polarization in our culture, especially along the rural-urban divide. So, the Soil Erosion Service became the Soil Conservation Service, and as of 1994 became what is now the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And Paul takes office and oversees that change in name, but it's also a transition toward a wider scope of work within the agency. That itself is undergoing a lot of changes. Some of this history is often forgotten that in the early years of the Clinton administration, that first year, Al Gore was put in charge of what was called the reinventing government effort of downsizing and streamlining government agencies. So Paul's first job when he was named was to actually downsize the agency by 10%. Tough gig to take on. But he oversaw retirements and new hires and actually was able to diversify the agency. I'll talk about that in a minute. But this wasn't done willy-nilly. It wasn't done by people coming in and throwing government workers out of work. It was done through a series of forums and focus groups around the country discussing with the clients of the agency how this would best be done. And along the way, it also, as Paul was beginning to formally take office, he helped work out agreements with the other agencies on all kinds of things, including, I mentioned here, wetlands. But the name change comes, and as that name change comes on to the NRCS, Paul is named chief. I'm not going to be able to do a deep dive into all the things Paul did in his 4 years as agency chief, but I'm going to mention a few of them that are particularly relevant for this presentation. And that starts with this, in fact. Paul, working with the Forest Service especially, and with state and private forestry efforts, helped to create the National Agroforestry Center. So it's a partnership across agencies. There had been work on agroforestry before then, but it gets formalized and better funded and better organized and coordinated through the National Agroforestry Center, which is still going despite some pressures, especially in the last year. Here's something we don't often think about. It's the 90s. The information revolution is afoot, and technologies are changing rapidly on a daily basis. The Soil Conservation Service must have been one of the most data-rich agencies in the federal government. And so it became a real necessity right away to figure out how to deal with the flow of information and adapt to the new technologies. It's something we don't often think about, but I can remember myself in those days trying to figure out how to use email for the first time. So Paul actually oversaw this effort to streamline the agency in terms of personnel, but also to respond to the growing information technologies that are rapidly infiltrating our culture. The 96 Farm Bill, often called the Freedom to Farm Act, this is the Farm Bill that gives us a lot of the standard programs that we now see at work in America's working lands. Continuing the CRP program, but also bringing on board environmental quality incentive programs, EQIP, as it's often called, habitat incentive programs, wetland reserve program. Again, I'll draw attention to that last bullet, authorizing the establishment of tribal advisory councils for the first time to collaborate with the tribal nations on stewardship of tribal lands. And in fact, Wisconsin, I'm proud to say, became the first to establish a tribal advisory council I think last I checked, I think about half the states have this online. And this may have been because of Paul's connection with Ada Deer, who deserves an entire presentation on herself, one of the great leaders not only in Wisconsin here nationally. She was chair of the Menominee Nation. Paul and Ada served side by side and were in many meetings together. And so I often wonder if Wisconsin became the first because Ada Deer was always proud of being from Wisconsin. Wildlife. Paul raised the profile of wildlife conservation within the NRCS's mission and created new programs. And this Wildlife Habitat Management Institute came online through his watch. And he put a high priority on this. It had always been an incidental part of the Soil Conservation Service, but Paul raises the profile. Here's one that probably has had greater quiet effect than almost anything Paul did in terms of policies that affected land use directly, and that was the Conservation Buffer Initiative in 1997. When you fly over, especially the Midwest, you can see the buffers at work, filtering runoff from the nearby farm fields. 2 million miles of buffers over 5 years. That was the goal. By a decade or so later, they had probably met that goal. I'd have to go back and check the numbers. But an absolutely critical piece of the evolution of NRCS's mission and of putting now we look at these strips and we look at the advantages they have, not cleaning water, but providing pollinator habitat and so many other benefits that come from buffers in our working landscapes. And the last thing I'll focus on is this report that I mentioned at the outset, A Geography of Hope. Paul always had an interest in communicating the work of the agencies he worked with and for to allow the citizens of the country, of the state of Iowa, wherever he was working, to understand that mission better. And so he took on and brought his staff aboard to work on a report that would communicate the significance of private land conservation. This report was published in 1997, if I correctly remember, and was distributed to every member of Congress. The story behind it is a fascinating window into itself. Paul liked to get out of the office, and so here he is with senior staff, actually at Aldo Leopold's shack in Wisconsin here at a time when there was no running water, no electricity within a half mile. But for several days, they convened at Leopold's shack. Paul wanted to draw upon the inspirational setting to craft a geography of hope, in which he in many ways, lays out his own philosophy of private lands conservation. And just a couple quick quotes from it. A land comprised of wilderness islands at one extreme and urban islands at the other, with vast food and fiber factories in between, does not constitute a geography of hope. So here he is in the middle of our landscape, in a sense, between the wilder end of the spectrum and the urban end of the spectrum, saying we need to pay more attention to the working landscapes of the continent. And here he draws directly upon Leopold in this opening line here. As we use land, we paint our individual and community portraits on the land. That's a metaphor that Leopold used. Done well, these portraits can be a source of pride. But he goes on to say in this introduction to this report that we need to think of private lands as not being devoted just to single purposes, but that raising the interest in allowing private landowners and on our nation's farms, ranches, and private forest land to serve multiple functions that we and all other life depend upon. And this is the phrase you'll often see in the literature and in policy now is multifunctional agriculture, where it's not just producing the food we all need, but it's producing all the other benefits that we as individuals and communities need. Paul leaves after 4 years, his service as chief of the NRCS. He's lauded by his friend and colleague, Senator Tom Harkin, upon his leaving. Here in the congressional record, Al Gore I'd say Paul was a mentor to Gore in terms of teaching him about the importance of private land conservation. And Gore took to heart actually a lot of what Paul was able to do at the NRCS. So, a little summary here of Paul's legacy at the agency. He oversaw its transition and modernization. He had a really gift for appreciating both the history and recognizing and honoring that history, but also pushing the agency forward. He really diversified the workforce. He brought in more people of different backgrounds and identities into the NRCS workforce than had ever been there before. He reinvigorated the mission and agency, expanded the vision and scope of its responsibilities through those programs I mentioned, and there were a lot of newly mandated conservation programs that he had to roll out through those Farm Bill programs. And looking outside the NRCS, it was really, again, something that was something natural to him was to work toward greater interagency cooperation, educating the public about the role of the NRCS, and becoming, just in everything he said and did, a champion of private lands conservation. He would go on, return to the farm in Iowa. That's really why he left. He missed being on the farm in Iowa. This isn't his farm, but it's in the same area, northeast Iowa. He did serve for a couple years as head of Iowa's Department of Natural Resources, but he felt the growing polarization was really starting to affect the way he could do what he hoped he could do. So it was a short term. He again returned to the farm, but he could never step away. In 2004, he ran for Congress. As he says here, as you look at his campaign brochure, he's running as an independent Democrat. He's very difficult to characterize according to standard political pigeonholes. He was very independent minded. He was a rural progressive in a part of Iowa that had not elected many Democrats. So he was constantly trying to find the connections and build the bridges between different parts of the landscape and his community. By this time, he was an elder in his circles, well recognized as a pioneer and leader in the sustainable agriculture movement in Iowa and beyond. He put his time to different organizations. I'll mention the one because it's close to me, of course, and that is he became a board member of the Aldo Leopold Foundation. And here you see two of Aldo and Estella's children, Estella Leopold and Carl Leopold, with whom he served back about 20 years ago now. And in his last years, Paul did think more consciously about writing. He, in fact, really wanted to do a book, and he shared a lot of his drafts with me, which set me up to take on this project of editing his writings. Um, I'll say just this about the book. This isn't a book event, but I will say that what I've tried to do in editing his writings is build that arc from the early days of the farm crisis in the mid 80s when he took office to the end of his years when he was writing about climate change and agriculture, writing about the changes in our political culture, and deeply worried about the divides growing in our political culture. I'll end up here with just a couple quotes from the book, just to highlight a few of the areas. I could do many, but I'll just highlight three areas in which he was devoted to across his political career and across his policy-making career. Those are different. I could talk about that, but when he was helping shape policy, research was always so important. The purpose of research at our universities isn't simply to produce more jobs. It's more than that. Now more than ever, our research should be allowed to focus on public as well as private concerns. So research in the public interest. That was always part of his approach. And every position he had, he was a champion for scientific research. This idea of integrated agriculture, multifunctional farming, becomes ever more important, especially as Iowa goes more and more into the ethanol uh, envelope, right? Iowa farmers could proudly show the world they can contribute to reducing climate change while serving multiple functions rather than just growing corn and soybeans. I believe no agriculture is sustainable if it ignores the health of the natural ecosystem where it operates. So this championing of integrated approach that connects soil health and the food movement and landscape level conservation, restoration, water, climate change, biodiversity, the health of our rural communities, the health and resilience of our rural economies. All of this gets wrapped up in his later writings. He writes about this. And then finally, Paul's commitment to raising again the profile of private land conservation. He writes in one of his later writings, it deserves an elevated position within mainstream conservation and environmentalism, a societal commitment separate and distinct from its current position as a stepchild within agribusiness dominated farm policy. What he's saying behind that is we've invested most of our hopes in the Farm Bill and its conservation programs. They've done amazing, good work. But he is increasingly thinking we need to do more. We need, in fact, what he came to call a Private Lands Conservation Act, akin to the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Wilderness Act, all the other great acts. He felt private lands deserved at least the same amount of attention. So, some final words. Paul's was a life devoted to public service, guided by a strong ethical framework in his public and private life, and in considering our relations to land. He was a man of great independence and integrity with a vision rooted in the land and really deeply informed by the history, which is why it's so fitting that I'm able to be with you all today. Paul was a student of conservation history. He understood these trends over the last century, century and a half. He understood the needs of the future, especially in terms of the cultural aspects of conservation going forward. So with that, I hope I'm not too much over time. Just a thank you to everybody, for all of you, but also to the Johnson Center that Paul's family and friends created after his passing, my colleagues at the Leopold Foundation, Center for Humans and Nature, the Forest History Society, and especially thank you, Jamie Lewis.
Thanks so much, Curt. Just a reminder, we're taking questions through the Q&A forum, not in the chat. Please submit your questions there, and we'd appreciate it if you'd put your name and or affiliation. It helps us keep track of the questions. I do have, I want to start you with one question, and I appreciate that we have some in the queue, but just very briefly, for a scholar wanting to do more research on Paul, are his papers located in an archive, and if so, where?
They are not yet. The family holds most of Paul's materials still. And there are, however, of course, in his years in public service, you'll find things in the National Archives and presumably in Iowa too. I did not do the deep dive on that. I was really focused on just getting the published writings together. But someone can help us by going into the National Archives and USDA records, especially for this chapter that I focused on today is NRCS years. So no, that's a chore waiting to be done.
Okay, so there is opportunity for somebody to do that. They would have to work, it sounds like, with the Johnson family right now anyway, to access the bulk of his
Yeah,
records.
the good news is through the process of doing the book, I got a pretty good handle myself on where these records sit. And if anyone is really interested in pursuing this, there have been a couple scholarly productions out of all this. There are a couple theses and dissertations, particularly written about the Groundwater Act I mentioned.
Mhm.
And I'm hoping there's some in the works on the NRCS years too. Really important time of transition.
Okay. Craig Patterson wrote in to say E.O. Wilson in his book Consilience talks about how we are drowning in data while starving for wisdom. Can you speak to this relative to agriculture and maybe forestry and conservation? And if you have one or two examples of um, that, it'd be appreciated.
Wow, that's that's a big one. Um, well, how to deal with the flood of information. You know, it's something we all face in every walk of our lives now, and how to make sense of it. And that's where, of course, we as historians hopefully can be helpful, helping us to see the patterns and see the long-term trends and help us wade through that ocean of information to see where the wisdom lies. And this is something I really appreciated about Paul, and I noted from an early in my interactions with him, he was deeply involved in the minutia of policy making. And anyone who's Worked with policymakers, you know how that goes. You can never see the light of day because you're drowning in constant information and communications. Paul had the ability to step back, step up, rise above it, step away from the arena, and compose himself. And so his work, let's just take, okay, one example. I'll just mention that report he did, Geography of Hope. He understood that um, we needed to fill in a gap that had the environmental movement had unbeknownst to itself created for itself, that this urban and suburban environmental movement had lost in some ways its connections with rural America and private land conservation. He said we got to work on this. We have to share what we do as an agency with all the reams of information that agency had done over the years. So he said, let's do a attractive report using the best data we can get, but let's make it readable. Let's make it an attractive one that people can absorb, and it succeeded. So he always knew that he had to step back, and we all strive to do that. Of course, we all strive to rise above the demands of our of the day on our attention to try to see those larger patterns. But he's a great example of a public official who I think succeeded at doing that.
Michael Jacobson observed that given Paul's time in the Peace Corps and his thesis earlier in his life, it seems, and Michael's not sure if Paul remained engaged with what was going on in Africa after he became a farmer. But his question is, if you might be able to share what Paul's thoughts or actions on the fact that land conservation needs planetary
Yeah,
approaches as much as local or national ones.
yeah. I'll mention a couple things on that. One, and this was brought up by someone in one of my book presentations over the last few months, asking me whether I thought his work in the Peace Corps in Africa had helped inform his later policy work directly, and especially around the theme of thinking about community-based approaches, which is, of course, one of the major trends of the last generation of moving away from the top-down Washington centralized approach to watershed-based, community-based approaches. And I very strongly believe that now. Um, it was there already through understanding the history of the Soil Conservation Service, but I think Paul's work in communities as a Peace Corps volunteer helped to just orient. I don't think he did it very consciously. I think it just becomes part of the way you see the world. So yeah, I think, but all the other thing, I mean, there's also specific policy questions that came up through his career. And the one that comes to mind that I briefly mentioned earlier was Iowa was one of the first states to go on record opposing the apartheid regime in South Africa in the 1980s. And there was a floor vote in the Iowa House of Representatives that Paul helped to lead on that. So his familiarity with Africa and his awareness of global scale issues definitely played into the day-to-day work he did as a legislator as well.
Okay. Mark Fiji was
Hmm.
coming to us from Montana. Um, he asks, what advice do you have for us in the far west, which is obviously unlike Iowa, and who seek to address the private lands connection to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem? What advice do you have
Mhm.
to address that connection, especially as regarding wildlife? That's it.
Oh, well, Mark, first, good to hear from you and best wishes. You know, I have a number of friends living and working in Greater Yellowstone, and I read the dispatches, and I don't know if I'd recognize it anymore. I haven't been out to that part of the country in quite a while, but the growing intensity of land use, frankly, the wealth that is accumulating and driving land use in the entire landscape of the Greater Yellowstone. But Mark, to go to your point, wildlife is mobile. It crosses boundary lines. It crosses public, private, and tribal boundary lines. And so we cannot sustain, especially in that part of the country with its great migrations, we can't sustain anything if we're not thinking across property boundaries. And we've known this. We in conservation biology have been working on this dilemma for 30 years. I mean, we've always worked on it, but it's become much more of a conscious. effort of, in the words of one of the books I had a chance to contribute to, how do we achieve stewardship across boundaries? And this is one of the things that led to Paul's work. I don't know what advice to give you on this, except I know that day to day people on the land, in the agencies, especially in journalism, I'm a great fan of Todd Wilkinson out there and his writing, are trying to find ways to do this, even as the intensity of land use in that region uh, grows ever greater. Um, but we have to get back to the, let me try to connect this back to Paul, that his emphasis on not just focusing on the public land part of this formula, that we have to find a way to incentivize private landowners, reward them for their stewardship. This is the great dilemma, one of the great dilemmas in the history of conservation. How do we incentivize farmers, foresters, ranchers, other landowners? What are the other mechanisms we have? This is the basis of Leopold coming forward and say we need an ethic. You need an ethic to help guide this, and Paul picks up on this. So it's a complex formula, and I'm not giving a very adequate answer to your question, Mark, but that's what comes to my mind.
It also, Mark, I appreciate the question, but it's specific. So Kurt, I appreciate that you broaden it out beyond Yellowstone too. It goes back to having an ethic, not prescription for a specific place, if I understood you correctly. Terry Allendorf asks, what are the lessons we can learn from Paul as individuals that might inspire our own journeys in conservation?
Mm,
So I'll help you a little, I hope, and ask if there are two or three ideas or maybe even mantras, but that might not be the right word.
mhm.
But just a couple of, or narrow it.
Yeah,
Did he have a North Star in terms of thinking?
yeah. Well, I have two just wrote down. I'll see if a third pops into my head for you, Jamie.
Okay.
First, you'll see this in the book and some of his writing. Paul was not only a student of history and conservation, he was deeply, deeply fascinated by the history of particular lands, including his own farm. He knew the history going back to the ice ages,
Hmm.
and he wrote about this. He understood indigenous land ownership and stewardship. He understood the history of settlement and colonization. So he always encouraged others to look into the history of their landscape, their own local landscape. And this leads to the second one, which is it doesn't have to be a rural place necessarily. Every place, of course, as we know in environmental history, has layers and layers of history. And one of my favorite stories of Paul was he's invited to give a talk at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And in anticipation of that, while he was chief of the NRCS, he had someone do the very first soil survey for Manhattan. And he brought those results to the museum, right? So, so that's my second one is realizing that no matter where you are in the landscape, from a remote area to the most urbanized, you are part of a continuum. And you can have a personal connection. And we all need to have more personal connections with the places we live and work and play. And I guess the third one I'd say is just off the top of my head is none of us does this alone. We do this in community. We do this in our landscapes that we share with others. And we live in a time of great division and political change. And it's more important than ever that we recognize this. Paul was a great spokesperson because he could speak to just about anybody. And I think this is something all of us can just have to do our best every time we have the opportunity is to work and talk with those of us in our communities who may not share our views, but that we have to find ways to finding the common ground. And Paul was devoted to finding common ground whenever he possibly could. So that's what comes to my mind on a really challenging question. Thank you, Jamie.
Don't thank me, thank Terry.
Oh, Terry, yes, thank you, Terry.
I just tee him up for you to bat back at me. Um, we have somebody anonymous says that observes that we may be moving into a post-Farm Bill era.
Oh,
Why? What does that mean for rural America? and for a potential private lands conservation act that, like the Geography of Hope, should not be just about conservation, but more broadly about rural people and communities.
Wow. Do we have another hour? Yes, indeed. First of all, the premise of the comment in question, yes. The Farm Bill has been regularly rolled out on a roughly 5-year basis ever since that 1935 Farm Bill, what we now call the Farm Bill. That model may be broken now. We don't know. We live in an unprecedented time. Many of you who follow it know that the Farm Bill has always served to, in its own kind of odd way, to bring together rural and urban interests. It's loaded with all kinds of stuff that appeals to both the rural and urban audiences, and it's allowed it to continue as a bipartisan effort. That may be broken now. So this has a lot of risks. It also may have some opportunities. I occasionally get in these conversations. I used to do more of it, but I'm not in the same circles I used to be on this. But the thing that came to mind when you read the question, though, was this is why we need to have our fellow citizens understand this history so we can understand how not only foreign policy has grown and emerged over the last 3 generations, but how the rural-urban divide that, dare I say it, is killing our democracy. If we do not solve the urban-rural divide in our political culture, we will all suffer. And we are seeing that every day right now. So knowing this history is helpful, and knowing how the things that connect us across the landscape are more important than the things that are manufactured to divide us. We need to know this history in order to help us reclaim our political culture in a more positive, constructive way. And this is maybe why I've been so devoted to this particular project with Paul. I saw him in the arena and saw him trying to do this on a daily basis, and I so admired and appreciated him for doing that. So the Farm Bill, maybe if we rethink it and come up with another new and different model, or whether we take the one that exists, we may be able to help reconstitute that as the pressures grow. That's a tough one to think through on just off my cuff, but this is again a reason why I think I got devoted to this project, was to help inform ourselves as we face these uncertainties.
Okay. Yes, an informed citizenry would make a world of difference. I'll state the obvious.
Mhm.
Anna Barker weighs in from the Twin Cities. She says she's in frigid Minnesota, and she asks if there are any current allies or kindred spirits in Minnesota.
Hmm. Absolutely. The
Okay.
first thing that comes to mind, I really recommend the Land Stewardship Project based in the cities. And I'll particularly recommend one book. Brian DeVore is a friend and knew Paul. In fact, interviewed Paul late in his life. Brian DeVore wrote a wonderful book 6 or 7 years ago called Wildly Successful Farming. I really recommend this book. I love this book. Brian did a wonderful job of profiling innovative, creative farmers throughout especially the upper Midwest, from his stance at the Land Stewardship Project. And so that's one specific one I can mention. There's also the Institute for Ag and Trade Policy based in the Twin Cities that does a lot of work on these policy issues and also works more internationally.
Okay. Um, this is a very specific question, but I'm actually going to ask it as an opportunity to comment. There may be material in your book about it, but an anonymous attendee asks if you recall, excuse me, any comments or written material from Paul regarding the NRCS's plant materials program. Is this something that you can speak to? Did Paul?
Uh, Only a little bit. I'm aware of some of the actions that were part of the mix, and I really realize when you're the head of an agency like that, every day is like a maelstrom. You're just trying to ride the waves, right? And so as I was doing my research, I did see, in fact, some references to that topic into the programs in NRCS that dealt with this, but I can't give you many more specifics on that. That's the sort of deeper digging that hopefully some future researchers can take on. But I will say one quick word on this, and that is Paul was tuned in to what was going on outside of the NRCS. He understood that even as he was doing what he was doing within the agency, the whole science and field of conservation biology was arising to address issues of diversity, not only at the species level, but at the genetic level too. And so thinking about crops, livestock, and diversity of crops and livestock was in the air in those years. And the USDA was responding to that. And I no doubt that NRCS was also involved in some of its facilities and its programs dealing with whether it's the seed conserving programs or, the other uh, programmatic stuff that is in the details of the rolling out of the different Farm Bill programs.
Okay. Well, we have several folks who wanted to just simply thank you for this webinar. And I want to join them in doing so as well. So Curt, thank you so much for this webinar and presentation. Tell us again the name of the book.
It's called We Can Do Better. That was one of Paul's favorite phrases. And so it's collected writings on land conservation and public policy. So, and the publisher is Ice Cube Press out of Iowa City.
Okay. Well, again, Curt, thank you so much.